Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Navina, and on behalf of the Sustainable Investment Platform, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you today to this webinar on measuring investment portfolio alignment to climate scenarios. This webinar is organized by the Sustainable Investment Platform and is supported by the UK government through its UK PACT program. This is the first of a four-part series on PACTA, a portfolio climate alignment methodology and its respective use cases. Today, you'll be hearing from the 2 Degrees Investing Initiative, or 2DII. It's an independent think tank behind the methodology. And before I introduce the speakers, I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping rules. The duration of this webinar is 90 minutes, and we'd like it for it to be as interactive as possible. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. So please feel free to drop in as many questions as you'd like in the Q&A box. We'd like to request that you keep your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat function, if you could. There will also be a feedback form that will be put into the chat function at the end of the session, and we'd really appreciate if you could take the time to fill that out. With that being said, I would now like to introduce our speakers. We have George Harris, who is Product Lead of PACTA for Banks, Naya Herrera, who is Product Lead of PACTA for Investors, and Daisy Pacheco, who is Emerging Markets Analyst, and all of them represent 2DII. So George, I'd like to hand over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Navina, for that introduction. I see that the participants are slowly increasing, so I'll begin the presentation now, but we'll not get into the kind of the real details of it as we try to wait for more people to join as well. Of course, this webinar is being recorded, so we will of course share the slides afterwards as well, just in case anyone joining in the next couple of minutes is missing the introduction as well. So thank you very much, Navina, for the introduction, and I will begin our presentation now. Great. So the first thing to say is a massive thank you to our organizers and our funders for funding this work. So who are the funders? This is UK PACT, and specifically their country programs, their country program within Malaysia. So this is UK government funding, and the project that we're working on is around harnessing green finance through climate-related risk management and opportunities in Malaysia. When we circulate these slides later, I'd encourage you to go check out some of the incredible work some of the other projects under this work are doing, and you can see that in the link on the screen at the moment. So as part of this work, this has come in two years. The first year in 2021, we were working with our implementation partners, WWF Malaysia. We continue this work into this year. In that first year, we were focusing on sectoral guides. This was covered from WWF. And from the finance side, we were working with corporate lending institutions, so banks, and also through an advisory role and a reviewing role with the Bank Negara Malaysia's upcoming climate risk document as well. This pilot study, if you will, based on the PACT methodology with a couple of banks, several banks in Malaysia, we published the results of this as part of a white paper, which again, we will share at the end of this presentation. And that was the findings of which, were presented as part of the JC3 webinar series at the end of last year. So there's been multiple JC3 ones, and I'm referring specifically to the PACTA for Banks and PACTA JC3 webinar. So for those of you that were a part of that, we focus there on PACTA for Banks, corporate lending. Here, the focus is going to be on PACTA for investors. Hence, the organizers, and a big thank you to the Sustainable Investment Platform for putting together this webinar series and helping us reach the network of investors and other stakeholders that we have on this call today. So with that, the final point there is the implementation partners, 2 Degrees Investing Initiative and WWF Malaysia as well. So quickly on the agenda for today, we'll do a quick round of introductions. So I'll introduce 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. The presenters have been covered by Navina at the beginning, so thank you for that. and then I'll move on to this webinar series. So this is the first in a 4-part webinar series, and I'll detail the content of that in a couple of slides' time. Then we're going to focus on climate alignment, climate scenario analysis, and we're going to take quite a conceptual angle to this. The concept of portfolio alignment, climate change scenario analysis is rapidly developing, and it's becoming increasingly prevalent in the climate finance space. I think it makes sense at this stage to take a step back and to really make sure we understand what we mean here from a conceptual level. So we're just going to focus on climate alignment to begin with. And in doing so, we're going to try to demonstrate the benefits of this PACTA approach. So this will take different data inputs, capital flows, I'll come and explain what this means, sectoral decarbonization pathways, you can also think of these as climate change scenarios. And then thirdly, the climate indicators. So the unit of measurement that we'll be using, or the data point, to measure this portfolio alignment and the climate scenario analysis that follows. Then I'll hand over to Daisy, who's going to take you through the PACTA methodology. When we say the PACTA methodology, we're kind of thinking about accounting principles. So allocation rules that we'll be applying and attribution rules that we'll be applying. So when we're allocating those climate indicators to your portfolio, so from the companies and their production values, which we'll describe, up to the portfolio, so connecting your capital flows, your financing to the companies, which rules do we apply for this, which accounting principles, allocation rules. Then also on the other side of the equation, which attribution rules do we apply when we apply carbon budgets? So the thing that we're all trying to keep in check here to solve climate change, the carbon budget, how do we attribute that to your portfolio as well? Then after that, we'll hand over to Naira, who will take us through the PACTA metrics. So what you can get out of PACTA, what are these results you'll be seeing? And then finally, we'll wrap up with some key messages and next steps. Of course, we'll be leaving space at the end for Q&A. And again, we encourage you to make use of the Q&A box throughout this presentation. So quickly then, who are 2 Degrees Investing Initiative? Do a quick introduction. So we're founded in 2012, and we've been thinking about the ideas of portfolio alignment and climate change in the financial system since 2012. So we're working globally, got main offices in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels, myself in London. We're collaborating with financial institutions, other NGOs, university, policymakers, and supervisors, and we're a non-commercial, non-profit organization. We are essentially an independent think tank. We get our funding through different sources, as mentioned today, through UK PACT, but also from other governmental organizations and from a bit from philanthropy as well. Then finally, our mission statement is around aligning financial markets and regulation with climate goals. So we have several research themes that we look to achieve this mission statement. The first one, what we're here to talk to you about today, is PACTA. So portfolio alignment through climate scenario analysis. The first piece, and that's the cornerstone to a lot of the other bits of work we do. And that's exactly what you're going to get the full breakdown of today. The second piece then is around risk management, and this draws a lot on the learnings from PACTA. This will come through in some of the latter webinars as well. And here we're looking at supporting long-term risk supervision, and here we're looking at stress testing as well. Then we have this piece around impact. So with the impact question, we're trying to evidence the impact that financial institutions can have in the real economy. And how can we prove this? Can we create an evidence base to steer best practice when we're talking about actual change and the actions that we can take as financial institutions to drive impact? That's the third piece. And we also have a piece around retail investing. So this is about supporting consumer sustainability goals and mapping the preferences of retail investors with the financial products being offered on the market. This is becoming very prevalent in the EU at the moment, with new regulation coming out on exactly this topic. Then just to mention that we work in developed markets, but also in emerging markets. Again, part of this work. And you'll hear from Daisy later, who has a lot of experience working in Latin America, as does Naira. Then finally, to mention that we're always looking for new developments, new research areas, and we can touch briefly on that towards the end as well. Great, so quickly, myself, George Harris, the Pacta for Banks product lead. So again, if you're getting bored of hearing our Pacta introduction, you'll see from our previous ones, Pacta for Banks work. Yeah, so that's myself. Then Naira, who's our Pacta for Investors product lead. She's going to be taking you through the investor product later today. And then, of course, Daisy, who's our kind of emerging market specialist as well. And of course, you've been seeing her throughout this 2-year program, if this isn't the first time you've heard from us. Great. So with that, I will get on to this 4-part webinar series that will be running throughout this year. So this is all around capacity building and raising awareness on Pacta, but also on its use cases. So how we can start to action these results to try to drive change, but also to really make use of these metrics rather than just having them for the sake of having them. As part of that, I think it's really important that we encourage a two-way conversation here. Each different financial institution will have different use cases and different climate journeys, if you will. We will actually be visiting Malaysia in a couple of weeks' time. We mentioned this towards the end, and we really encourage you, if you do have the time, to speak with us, perhaps in person and also virtually, so that we can really help to design these metrics with your institutions in mind, with a two-way kind of feedback stream, so that we can make these methodologies as impactful and as useful to the users as possible. So with that, the first webinar today, going to be focusing on the methodology, more conceptual points of the methodology. Then the second webinar, we're going to be talking about the practical implementation. So the Pacta for Investors methodology and tool is a free online tool that all users can use, and indeed many have in the past. So by the end of the second webinar, you can follow some simple basic steps, and then you can get a full set of Pacta results for each of your portfolios. So that's a kind of a key takeaway that you can have if you stay with us throughout this webinar series. And yeah, I really encourage you to do that and to follow the second webinar. Then the third and fourth, we're going to be focusing in on these different use cases. So now that you've understood the methodology, you physically got the results in front of you, we can start to discuss what we can do with these results. So the first webinar is going to focus on 2 use cases: risk management as a use case, and also disclosure and reporting. Then the fourth webinar is going to move on to target setting and steering. For these latter 2 webinars, we're going to try to get in some case studies and some use cases from other financial institutions across Latin America and also from Europe, to get their take on this and to share knowledge across the board so that we can start to action these results. Great, so that's enough about all the introductions. And now I will move on to the methodology and what we're talking about with climate alignment. So the first thing, always a good place to start, is why is this important? Why are we here talking about climate alignment? So what can we do with this? What can we do with climate alignment, climate portfolio methodologies, and climate scenario analysis? The first thing is we can use it in disclosure and reporting. This can be an effective tool for communicating to our stakeholders, internally and externally, on our climate positioning and our climate alignment, and also reporting to regulators. This latter half, reporting to regulators, might not be at the level of maturity that it is in Malaysia now. We've just seen the TCFD become law in the UK. So this is a fast emerging area, and we're seeing regulators start to pick up on it as well. So even though it's not ready yet, it might be coming in the next couple of years. So really keeping ahead of the curve here. Second one then is we can use climate alignment, climate scenario analysis from a risk management point of view. So it helps us to understand our exposure to climate transition risk at a qualitative level. Of course, when we talk about climate change risks, we look at this from a physical risk perspective and also a transition risk perspective. So physical risks, the physical damage that climate change will do to things that we finance, and also the value chain and the supply chain. Value chain risk becoming incredibly pertinent at the moment from different reasons, of course, from the pandemic and also from the terrible ongoing war that we have in Europe at the moment. But now when we see that translate into climate change risk in the slightly medium to longer term, we can start to think about transition risks and again, physical risks. This is transition risk focused. Then the third thing here is how do we begin to mitigate those transition risks? We can mitigate these risks through different strategies, and we'll speak about these in latter presentations. But we can think about client selection and also engagement with those clients. This tool will help you to identify clients which you want to be doing this engagement or the selection with. And finally, it can be used for target setting. We see a proliferation of targets being set around net zero as part of the respective net zero asset owners and managers and others organizations being set up, and also for strategy and decision making. So already starting to think about some of these use cases and how this can be useful to us as financial institutions. Then quickly to mention some upcoming documents and some that are already out there that reference scenario analysis. The first one is the Bank Negara Malaysia. They have an exposure draft out at the moment on climate risk management and scenario analysis. So we've already got that scenario analysis in the title. As part of the first bit of our work, WWF and 2 Degrees were kind of submitting a consultation towards this. And I'm sure some of you will already be familiar with this exposure draft. In this, it mentions climate risk measurements and also scenario analysis. So we hope to describe throughout today how PACTA can be used as a tool to do scenario analysis. Bank Negara Malaysia will have to come in with their own guidance on that. We're not preempting that, but we're trying to explain how, from our perspective, PACTA can be used as a scenario analysis tool. So that's the first one, Bank Negara Malaysia. The second thing I'd like to mention is the NGFS. So the NGFS is focused more on the central bankers and the supervisors, and they have out this guide to climate scenario analysis. So you can see a quote from that document on the screen as well. Then the third one here is part of the GFANS. So the GFANS, the Glasgow Framework for Net Zero, that's not quite what it is. So the Mark Carney initiative that brings together all of the respective net zero alliances called the GFANS. And part of the GFANS, they have this group called the Portfolio Alignment Team. They are tasked with creating synergies, enhancing the methodologies, and then scaling the uptake of different portfolio alignment methodologies, one of which is PACTA. That's exactly what we're here to talk to you about today. And they speak about the pros of using forward-looking metrics within this portfolio alignment piece. Encourage you to go check out that document. And if you do, we also have a supplementary one from 2 Degrees' side called the Mr. Postman paper. I can share that in the links later. It's a bit technical, so bear with us on that. Then finally, of course, to mention the TCFD, and they have a document. They've always been preaching about using climate scenario analysis within their work. Great, so that's just a bit of a flavor as to how the space is moving and different initiatives out there talking about portfolio alignment and talking about climate change scenario analysis. So let's take a step back then and let's think about alignment and what are we actually talking about here? So what is alignment? Seems like a silly question, but I think it's worth mentioning. So alignment is a comparison or the distance between two positions. So then what does that mean in a climate perspective? When we talk about climate change, we're all very familiar with the Paris Agreement. And within the Paris Agreement, when we refer to financial systems, the most important article is Article 2.1c. This states that we need to make financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So think about that definition of alignment. What is climate alignment in the context of the Paris Agreement? It's the alignment between the capital flows, financial flows consistent, and climate goals, pathways towards low carbon gas emissions, to be measured using different climate indicators. So with that statement, let's break it down into the different data points and the different things we need to understand so that we can measure this portfolio alignment. The first one there is the capital flows. So what portfolio data do we need on the financial institution side? The second thing then is these climate goals. So what are these sectoral decarbonization pathways, also known as climate scenarios, that we can measure our capital flows towards, the alignment piece? And then how are we going to measure this? What are those climate indicators that we use to measure this alignment? We're going to try to explain why we believe that physical bottom-up asset level production values are the most important climate indicator, and indeed the ones that we use when we talk about PACTA. So what was the first one there then? We're talking about the capital flows. Within PACTA, we look at the corporate lending side of things. That's been discussed in previous webinars. In this webinar, we're focusing in on the investor side of things. And with that, we have two key asset types. So an investor holds equities and also corporate bonds. So in the first one, the equities, these finance the kind of company's book value, and this can lead to new capital expenditure on different physical assets in the real economy. For example, the likes of power stations, oil and gas wells, physical automotive manufacturing lines, steel and cement, and also aviation. Those are the PACTA sectors. We'll come back to those. Then the other thing that investors kind of do is around corporate bonds, fixed incomes, and these are financing in the company in the more short-term or long-term debt, the financing of existing assets. So equities, potentially new assets, not always to existing ones as well. Then also on the debt side, looking more at financing existing assets. So the first bit around capital flows. The second bit then is what do we need to measure these capital flows towards or against? So here we introduce the idea of sectoral decarbonization pathways or climate change scenarios. So very high level, the climate scientists can define a carbon budget. So we have an X and a Y axis. We know that CO2 emissions correlate almost linearly with a temperature rise. So if we want to put a temperature goal of 1.5, net zero, 2 degrees, however we want to scope it, we can work out from the carbon budget how much CO2 we've got left, like a cumulative CO2 budget. What we then need to do is we need to translate that into kind of the real world. So we need to include societal and economic factors, such as population, economic growth, political considerations, demographics, and a multitude of other factors. So then, how, given all these societal and economic factors, can we keep within the carbon budget to mitigate the worst effects of climate change? Then what we need to do is we need to break that down into real economic sectors. So here I'll introduce the PACTA sectors. We have the fossil fuel sectors, so oil and gas, coal. We also have transport sectors like the automotive sector, aviation. Incidentally, we'll be adding shipping shortly, but it's not quite ready yet. And then the next big one we have is the power, utilities, and then of course industry, so steel and cement. This doesn't mean to say that these are the only climate relevant sectors, but these are to some extent the most relevant ones. Noticeable exceptions there, especially in Malaysian context, are of course agriculture. deforestation, and of course, real estate. We have open work streams looking into those, but at the moment, they're not covered under the PACTA methodology. So now we've got these carbon budgets and we've translated them into specific sectoral pathways. So in each of those sectors, we have different decarbonization pathways or technology roadmaps. So let's take an example from the power sector. So the scientists and the modelers have broken down the different assumptions for the different sectors. And they say that in this year, we have, this is a hypothetical situation, this year we have 10 gigawatts coming from coal-fired power generation. If we're then to fast forward to 2050, and we want to keep below 2 degrees in this hypothetical world, we need 7 gigawatts to be coming from renewable energies, and we need 5 gigawatts to be coming from coal. This might not be cool. It's not really the case, but go over for the example. So you notice that 7 plus 5 is more than 10. This is because we're accounting for population, demographic change, and the such. So who does that? We, 2 Degrees Investing Initiative, do not come up with these pathways, but rather third parties do. So we have the International Energy Agency, the World Energy Outlook, also the Energy Technology Perspective. These are publications made by third parties, International Energy Agency in that case. We also have the Joint Research Center out of the European Commission. The UNFI also makes the IPR, Inevitable Policy Response Scenarios. And those that are familiar with the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, one of those elements within the GFANs that I mentioned earlier, particularly relevant to some of the members on the call today, they've commissioned a series of scenarios as well from the ISF. So it's the Institute for Sustainable Futures, and that's based out of Sydney, Australia. So all of these different parties and others create these sectoral decarbonization pathways, what we're referring to here as climate scenarios. And that is what we're going to measure those capital flows against to understand our portfolio alignment. To note, when we talk about the IPCC scenarios, as I'm sure some people are familiar with those, they're the ones that set the carbon budget. So the bit to the left, then the translation of those into actionable things that we can measure alignment against, the sectoral pathways, that is done by these third parties that I've just mentioned. So quickly then, also the third part here is what are the climate indicators that we're going to be measuring that alignment against? So here I'll introduce the PACTA data. So the PACTA sectors I covered just briefly, and you can see them on the screen. These account for roughly 75% of global CO2 emissions. That's why we think these are the climate critical ones. These are the ones that will be the most material in terms of transition risks to your portfolios, and also where the most action needs to be taken to drive climate change mitigation. That's why these are critical. This is why we're not focusing on health and IT, for example. Doesn't mean to say that we don't need to make efforts there as well, but in terms of material change, in terms of the most material transition risk, it's these sectors we're looking at on the screen. So what have we done? How do we measure alignment here? We have different production values for each of those different physical assets in the real economy. So we have a data set that has the build out capacities for each power station in the world. For each coal mining, oil and gas wells, we know the barrels of oil, we know the tons of coal. For automotives, we know the different technologies, electric vehicles, through to internal combustion engines, and we know each manufacturing plant, how many numbers of vehicles they will be producing. Same for cement, steel, and aviation. What we know with this is we know the forward-looking, up to 5 years in the future, what is planned. What are the production plans? What are the build-out plans of these physical assets? Are companies bringing online renewable power capacity? Are they taking offline coal-fired power generation? Are they ramping up production of oil and gas, or are they decreasing production of coal? So with that, we map those physical assets to the companies that own those. So up the corporate ownership structure, who owns the power station, which company owns that, which company owns that, and which company owns that. And then we link that company that issues securities through fixed incomes or through equities to your financial portfolio. So I mentioned that we have this for every asset in the world. Of course, there's a data caveat there, but just go with it from a hypothetical point of view for now. So on this slide, we mentioned some of the physical assets that we have in this data set. And when I say we, I should correct myself. This data set is owned by Asset Resolution. Asset Resolution is a commercial entity, and you can check out their website and their data offerings as well. But what they do is they give the underlying data to the Pacta tool that we're going to talk about in the next webinar so that you can get those results. So we'll share these slides as well. And of course, you can go check out Asset Resolution by themselves. So finally, before I hand over to Daisy, what are some of the pros and why do we use these climate indicators that are those physical production units that I've been talking about? So what are the pros of using physical, bottom-up, asset-level production as our climate indicator? So the first element here is this allows us to be forward-looking, 5 years forward-looking. This is important when we think about risk management. We want to know not the position of the company today or in the past, but what actions are they taking in the future, what capital expenditure, the evolution of their capital stock is happening in the future. So that's the forward-looking element. Second part is it's tangible. This is a tangible link to the real economy. Climate change manifests in the real economy. Climate change risks are felt in the real economy, also in the financial system. So we need that link to the real economy. Production values give us that. Other climate indicators, such as carbon estimates and carbon accounting, may as well, but we won't go into the cons of that. Rather, we'll try to focus on the pros of these ones. Third part here is it's linked to the business decisions of the corporates and indeed the investors and corporate lending if you're a bank as well. So these are kind of, tangible links, and these are inform the kind of business decisions of those influencing or leveraging their capital to make change or to manage risk. Those two go hand in hand. The fourth one then is it's the same unit that we have in those sectoral decarbonization pathways. So the second piece I talked about, the climate scenarios, the climate scientists and the modelers, they tell us the number of cars that need to be electric vehicle, the number of megawatts that need to be renewables. We have a one-for-one comparison. We don't need to do any modeling assumptions between the two. We can just compare them like for like. Then finally, the final 2 points, we have comparable data sets. Some other climate indicators, and here I'm thinking about carbon emissions, can be derived of different methodologies. You have different reporting frameworks, you have different, in some cases, accounting principles, although efforts are being made to align some of these. And one company's way of doing it and another company's, they might not always be comparable. Also, they lack from a coverage perspective. So not every company is disclosing their carbon emissions. If they're not, then you can get estimated ones, then we get a comparability issue again. With production units, we're always using the same modeling assumptions. Those are derived from business intelligence data sets, the stuff I talked about just now. So we think there's a coverage benefit. We have, okay, it's not 100%, but we have a pretty good coverage of all the assets and their production values. And we also have this comparability between the different data points as well. Okay, so I think you probably heard enough from me there. And I will now hand over to Daisy, I think, Daisy, who's going to take us through the methodology. So bringing all of those different data points and things that we're measuring together, thinking about the accounting principles that we use, and I'll stop speaking and hand over to Daisy. Thanks, Daisy.
Good. Thanks a lot, George, and good afternoon from my side. now that we have seen what climate alignment is from this introduction from George, and now that we have seen also the elements that climate alignment includes, the idea here is to present to you one portfolio climate alignment methodology called PACTA. So PACTA stands for Paris Agreement Capital Transition Assessment. And in few words, this is a methodology that allows financial institutions to measure the alignment of their portfolio with climate scenarios. So this is a very high-level introduction, but we will see in detail what it means. So if we go to next slide, we will see that here in this slide, we are putting together all the different climate elements that we just heard about. So financial flows, meaning financial portfolios, basically. Climate scenarios, which are the decarbonization pathways that George just explained to us, and also how these are linked together and how these can be translated into climate metrics to see the final results of the methodology. So before we go deep into the accounting principles of the methodology and the metrics, which we will hear from Naira, we will start with this slide that summarizes in a very high level how PACTA works. So we mentioned already that PACTA is a portfolio alignment methodology done through climate scenario analysis that allows financial institutions to measure the alignment of financial portfolios to various decarbonization pathways or climate scenarios. So if we start here on this bottom right of the slides, a core characteristic of the methodology is that alignment is measured based on the production values of physical assets on the real economy, which is what we were hearing before from George. And we have these production values across different sectors, which are the PACTA sectors that we also hear. So just to remind us, it will be oil and gas, coal, automotive, power, cement, steel, and aviation, and shipping will be soon included. So this is a data set that is provided by our data provider Asset Resolution, and this will tell us the actual production values of the assets as well as the forward-looking information. And we will also know from this data set where in the world the plants are located, how much they are producing now, again, their forward-looking information, and also which technology they are using to produce. Also, we will have information from who owns them and other different characteristics that will make us have this final data set that PACTA uses. So the rationale behind these sectors, George also mentioned, so these are the most climate critical sectors. These are responsible for over 75% of all CO2 emissions. And one important thing to keep in mind is that within these sectors, PACTA covers only the most climate relevant segment of the value chain, which will mean that, for example, for the power sector, we will cover only generation of power, but not transmission or distribution, for example. And the reason behind this is that PACTA considered that these segments are also the most critical and where the alignment efforts are needed. So if we focus on power generation units, for example, then one of the assumptions of the methodology is that the rest of the value chain of the sector will fall in line as well. So if we start with these production values, the first thing that we will need to do is to link them to the financial portfolios, which is the little house that we see there. And for this, we use two different approaches that we will see in a few minutes. So this is the first step. After we got the assets in the real economy attributed to the portfolio, we now need to measure the portfolio's alignment to different climate scenarios, mainly those coming from third-party institutions like the International Energy Agency. So this is like the second step, how to attribute, how to allocate the information coming from the scenarios to the portfolio. After we complete this process, the way that PACTA shows the results are through three different metrics, which are the technology mix. We will hear more about from Naira, but basically it shows the sector breakup by technology for the portfolio. We will also see the results through the volume trajectory metric, which is forward looking. So we will see over the next 5 years how companies will be building up capacities based on information on their capital expenditure plans. And also the third metric, which is the emission intensity metric, which we will have for some sectors, in specific cement, steel and aviation. But we will cover this later on with Naira. So if we go to next slide, just to go a little bit deeper into the accounting principles. The first principle of PACTA is the allocation principle. So this is, as I just mentioned, the first step in the PACTA methodology is to allocate the production values of the physical economic assets, what we were seeing at the beginning on the top right bottom of the slide, to financial instruments. In this case, we will need to allocate these production values to the equity and corporate bonds portfolios, which are the two financial assets that are covered in the PACTA for Investors tool. So the allocation principles vary slightly between the two types of assets. So if we start with the equity portfolios, the way that PACTA allocates production values is using what we call the ownership approach. So in this approach, the production values coming from those physical assets are allocated to the portfolio based on the number of shares that the portfolio owns of specific company. So if we try to make this, to explain this with an example, if a portfolio owns 50 shares of a company that has issued 100 shares in total in the market, then we will be allocated 50% of the company's production to the equity portfolio. So this is how is done the ownership approach. We will see a diagram later on to try to explain it a little bit further. If we go to next slide, for the corporate bond portfolio, we use what we call the portfolio weight approach, which is a bit different in the sense that given that we are unable to know the total amount of debt that company has issued, like in contrast to the information that we know on the shares that they have in the market. So we don't know the whole information of the total amount of debt. So we need to rely on the weight of the corporate bonds that we hold from a specific company in our portfolio. This means that if the corporate bond from, say, coal company A represents 10% of the total coal companies in your portfolio, then we will be allocating 10% of company A's production. If we go to next slide, we will see the representation or interpretation of these two different approaches using kind of a very simple example that we hope that it makes sense. So if we assume that there are two companies that make up a portfolio, so we have one portfolio with two companies, company blue and company orange, which are the circles that we see there. So the circles are the portfolios. In each portfolio, we have only two companies, company blue and company orange. And each company has an equal stake. So both are 50% and 50% of the portfolio. Each of the companies, so company blue has a total of 4 shares outstanding in the market, which are represented by the little certificates or small rectangles that we see on the slides with some written on them. So each company has a total of 4 shares outstanding. If we say if the portfolio, just let me pick this here. Yeah. So if we say that portfolio owns 1 share of the blue company and 4 shares of the yellow company, if we were using the ownership approach, we will end up with 1/4 of the production of the assets owned by the blue company. And why is that? Because we know that company blue has 4 shares outstanding in the market and the portfolio owns 1 of them. So we will end up with 25% of the production of that company allocated to the portfolio. In addition, we will end up with the full production of the assets owned by the yellow company, because we know that the yellow company has 4 shares outstanding and the portfolio owns these 4 shares. So we will have the 100% production values allocated to the portfolio. So this is how the ownership approach. In contrast, if we use the portfolio weight approach, the shares do not really have a role here because, as I was mentioning before, like we don't know the total amount of debt that is issued by a company. So instead, we need to focus on the weight of each company on the portfolio. So as company blue has a 50% on the portfolio, as we said at the beginning, that both companies has an equal stake on the portfolio. So if company blue has 50% weight on the portfolio, we will be attributed 50% of their production, meaning we end up with 2 power plants out of the 4 that company blue has. And similarly, since company orange also has a weight of 50% of the portfolio, we will be attributed 50% of the production, meaning we will end up with 1 power plant out of the 2 power plants that the company owns. So if we do a click, we will see that the differences of these 2 approaches is that the ownership approach on the one side takes into account the outstanding shares of the company, the total shares that have been issued in the market by this company, while the portfolio approach, the portfolio weight approach takes into account the company's stake in relation to the assets under management of the portfolio. So this is how we allocate the production values coming from the physical economic assets that we just saw from the different sectors to the financial instruments. And then the second step of the methodology is how to attribute these macro carbon budgets, as George was defining just before, how to attribute the information that we are having from the climate scenarios to what we call microeconomic actors, say the companies. So how do we know from the, or how is it that we need to attribute what the scenarios tell us to do for different pathways, how to attribute this to the companies that we have in the portfolio. So once we know the production associated to the portfolio from the first principle, we need to do this attribution. We need to take this information from the climate scenarios. To do that, we use this approach, which we call the market share approach. And the main assumption here is that the decarbonization efforts, so the information that is coming from the climate scenarios, those efforts that are required for a company are proportional to the share of the company in the market. So in other words, this market share represents the company's share of the total production in a given technology, of like within the sectors that we just saw. And also, just to finish with an example, we can say that if company A represents 10% of the market share in a given technology, then this company is required to make 10% of the sector's decarbonization efforts in that technology. And that is how we know what are the requirements for the company to make in order to follow certain decarbonization pathways. And now I will hand over to Naira, who will explain us how we will see these results into different metrics that PACTA gives us.
Great, thanks a lot, Daisy. So now that my colleagues did a great job explaining and presenting the introduction to climate alignment and the PACTA methodology, I will present the main PACTA metrics. We have more information on the interactive report, but today I will focus on the main metrics of the methodology. And of course, keep in touch with us and keep tuned, because in the next webinar, we will go through one of the interactive reports, so you will be able to see the other functionalities and information that you can get from the reports. So the metric that you are seeing on the screen is the volume trajectory chart. Each color of this chart represents or denotes what is expected to happen in terms of production by each scenario. In the screen, you are seeing an example that is coal mining in a corporate bond portfolio. The dotted line is the benchmark, which can be selected in the interactive report by the user. We have online different options, such as the Standard & Poor's 500, the MSCI World, the MSCI Emerging Markets. So it's really up to you, the benchmark you want to compare your portfolio with. The continuous black line is the trajectory of the portfolio. In other words, it represents the production plans of the companies your portfolio is invested in. So in this case, coal mining companies. And as we can see in the chart, what needs to happen according to the sustainable development scenario is in this technology is that the coal mining production decreases around 20% in the upcoming 5 years. This I know it because the green zone is has a negative slope, so that's the trend that the scenario is proposing to reach the target of that specific scenario. In this case, the companies that compose the portfolio and also the companies that compose the benchmark are planning to increase coal mining production. So we can see that the slope of both of the black lines have a positive trend. This is putting this portfolio on a trajectory with a higher temperature target than the CPS scenario. So if we would like to align with the SDS scenario, of course, what we will need to do is to engage with companies that are part of the portfolio, or think about the strategies that would allow me to have a negative slope to reach the targets of the SDS scenario denoted by the green zone. If we go to the next slide, I will present to you the technology mix. This is another PACTA metric that is a visual representation of how the exposure is spread among different types of technologies. So in this case, you can see the metric at a sector level, and in this example, it's for the power sector. You have a lot of information in this chart. So for example, in column 1, you have the current technology mix for the power sector of your portfolio. So you can see that at least 60% of your energy capacity generation is in brown technologies because it is about coal and oil. But if you compare column 1 and 2, you can compare your portfolio with the benchmark you are comparing yourself with. As I mentioned before, also for this chart, you will be able to compare with the different benchmarks we have in the platform. So Standard & Poor's, MSCI emerging market. Well, we have a list of them, and you can change them and compare with all of them whenever you want to. So the first line is about your portfolio. The second one is compared with the benchmark. So in this case, we can see that the benchmark has also that has a bigger exposure to green technologies. How we can see this? Because they have more exposure or higher exposure in renewables that the portfolio we are analyzing. The third line is the portfolio projection. So if we compare the line 1 and the 3, that represent the changes that the companies that are part of your portfolio will plan to do in the upcoming 5 years. So we can say that there's a little increase in renewable energy. And the other technologies remain a little bit constant. If we compare with the fourth line, that's how the portfolio would look like if it were aligned. So of course, if we want to be aligned, we need to increase our exposure to renewable energy and also to hydro energies. And of course, we need to reduce a lot the exposure in coal and in oil mainly. The fifth line of this chart give us information about how the benchmark will look like if it were aligned with the SDS scenario in 5 years. Yeah, so this is the technology mix at a sector level. In the next slide, I will show to you the technology mix at a company level. In the next slide, please. Here. So this metric is very similar to the previous one I showed you. The difference is that this is at a company level. So this metric and the previous ones that I showed you, so the volume trajectory chart and the technology mix, is available for the sectors where technology roadmaps exist. And in this case, we are seeing the metric for the power sector. This company level information is available for power and automotive sector, where we know which are the greener technologies to produce. So this provides valuable information because users are able to identify the companies that are driving the results. So for example, which companies are heavily invested in green technologies, or which ones are invested in brown technologies, and which are those technologies they are invested in. So we will know, okay, this company has 50% in green technologies, but we also know how much of that 50% is in renewables, how much is in hydropower. As you can see, this information can be used not just to think about exclusion strategies, but also about engagement strategies. So we can, if we see that the companies are planning to increase their stake in green technologies, we should try to engage with them to see how we can help them to increase even more that stake. This is one of the metrics that we have in the report, but we also have another chart that provides information about the company's current investment in low carbon technologies, but also future investment in low carbon technology. So of course, with that information and the information of this chart, you can take action and engage with companies. This information is shown for the companies that have the highest weight on your portfolios. And we show this information on listed equity and corporate bonds. So all the information is divided by type of asset. In the next slide, we will see the emission intensity. So the emission intensity metric is the one we use for sectors without defined technology roadmaps, such as cement, steel, aviation, because as you may already know, in these sectors, there is a lot of research on how to find greener options to produce or reduce the CO2 emissions. But still there is no option that proves scientifically which of the different proposals is the most sustainable and scalable option to be implemented around the world. So therefore, those options are not yet included in the climate change scenario, so are not included in our methodology either. With this metric, we use the sectoral decarbonization approach of SBTI to set the emission intensity target for each sector. And we compare the trend that the portfolio should follow according to the scenario and the trend that the portfolio is following. And that, of course, is the reflection of the climate performance of the companies the portfolio is invested in. It is important to mention here that we are using physical emission intensity, that is the absolute emission divided by the output value. So for example, you will see tons of CO2 per ton of cement produced or per ton of steel produced. This type of metric allows the user to understand the efficiency of the sector in terms of total emission per unit of common output. In the next slide, I will present to you the transition disruption metric. So this metric is complementary to the PACTA alignment model and was launched last year. The TDM, as we call it, provides a score of the medium-term potential disruption of the portfolio under the forecast policy scenario of IPR. This is represented by a quantitative score that measures the potential disruption in 10 years based on how far the portfolio lags or is ahead of the FPS scenario in the first 5 years. The higher the metric, the higher the disruption the portfolio can have. In other words, it measures how much you have left to do relative to how much time do you have left to do. In this way, this is a progress indicator tracking disruption. As you can see on the screen, if you have a score of 0, it means that you are fully mitigated against the scenario until 2030. Managed mitigation is from 0 to 1, so it means that your portfolio is a little ahead of the portfolio, but there's still work to do to reach the target of the scenario. From 1 to 1.5, the portfolio has not fully mitigated what the scenario proposes. And for us, a score over 1.5 means that there is an unmanaged disruption and that the portfolio is quite late. So with this metric, I like to do an analogy because I think it is also easier to understand. So for example, how I will do the analogy with a race. If we need to run 10K in 1 hour, the way we should measure the track the progress or the disruption will be, okay, if you finish the 10K you need to run the 10K in 1 hour. So if you finish the 10K in 30 minutes, in that case, your score will be 0 because you already did the job you had to do. If you run 5K in 30 minutes, your score will be 1. It means that you are on track, but you still have work to do. Like you still have to run the other 5K in the 30 minutes you have left. But if you run just a quarter of the distance, so 2.5 kilometers in 30 minutes, your disruption will be 1.5. This means that you are significantly behind to finish the 10K in the time you have left. And if you want to reach the target of the 10K, then you need to accelerate. So that's the same principle we apply to the evolution of the capital stock by portfolio companies, and that's the TDM. So if you have a score of 1.5, it means that you need to accelerate the transition if you want to be in line with the proposal of the scenario. In the next slides, thank you. Some key takeaway we would like you to keep in mind. So the first of all is PACTA is a tool, but also a methodology of portfolio alignment through climate scenario analysis. The methodology is based on a bottom-up and 5 years forward-looking asset level data and provides actionable results per sector. The tool covers the key climate scenarios that are responsible for about 75% of global CO2 emissions. And we have valuable information that we can use or that have different use cases. Some of them are going to be presented in the next webinars we will have very soon. On the next slide, please. So as Nadine and my colleague George mentioned before, this was the first of webinar out of 4 that we will present. The second webinar will be about how to use the interactive tool, how to prepare the information, how to upload the information to the platform, and how to read and interpret the results. The third one will be about the use cases. So we will see risk management, disclosure, and reporting. The fourth webinar about target setting and steering. So how to use the PACTA results in all those use cases. In the slides, you have a link to see a sample of the interactive report. You can go, give it a look, try to use the different options we have there. So you can change the scenarios. You can also evaluate the different benchmark we have in the tool. Prepare all your questions so we can go through one of the portfolios also in the next session, but also answer all the questions you may have about the sample report. We also invite you to fill this survey. We want to know what do you think about the presentation we are doing today, and we want to know also if you have more questions that you would like to ask us. The 2DII team will be in Malaysia soon, so do not hesitate to contact us if you have questions, if you want to discuss about the methodology, about different use cases. I think this is a great opportunity for all of you to have this discussion with us and see how we can use our tool for different purposes. George, I hand over to you.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Naira, and thank you, Daisy. And of course, thank you to all the participants for bearing with us throughout that. Yeah, so Daisy has kindly put in the chat box the sample report. If you want to go familiarize yourself with that, then of course we'll be going through that in detail and explaining to you how you can upload your real portfolios as part of the next webinar. And then, as Naira mentions, this quick survey as well. If anyone's got any questions they would like to ask now, we have 30 minutes or 25 minutes. Please drop them in the chat box or into the Q&A box. And you could also perhaps raise your hand and we can perhaps unmute you if you prefer to do it that way. So yeah, I'll leave some time for any Q&As. And yeah, just to say again, we will be in Malaysia from the 9th to the 13th, so the second week of May. And yeah, we really encourage you to reach out to us. More than happy to do in-person meets, and also we'll be in your time zone. So if you want to do virtual calls, be it 15 minutes on the methodology, any parts of this you didn't understand, any of your own use cases you want to bring forward, this is a really great opportunity to do so. And also thinking outside of kind of PACTA, more than happy to have any climate finance chats more broadly. So yeah, I hope that's a good opportunity there. Great, so we've got one question coming in already about agriculture. So no, at the moment, the PACTA methodology does not cover agriculture. And why does it not then is, remember we're talking about the different scenarios, sectoral decarbonization pathways. Agriculture doesn't currently have one of those. So we might have those from a carbon budget perspective, but when we try to translate that into actionable units and actionable, the PACTA methodology, if you will, we don't have a comparison to be made there. That being said, we are keen to explore this, as it is, of course, one of the most climate critical sectors, as is real estate. So real estate and agriculture are very much on the radar to include, but currently not covered. Doesn't mean to say that it's not relevant to look at as part of your climate strategy. Of course, it's hugely important to do that. And perhaps this is a point we can think about more and discuss as part of our in-person visit as well. Hope that answers the question. But any other questions? Anything at all? Yeah, please let us know. And if not, if you don't want to ask here, please do fill out the survey questionnaire as well, where we leave space for open questions. Okay, aside from the graph shown. Yeah, so the question is, aside of the graph shown, do we get PACTA results in numerical values too, i.e. the percentage and the percentage change? But Naira, do you want to take that one from a PACTA for investors perspective? Thanks.
Sure. So all the data that we use to produce these charts can be downloaded on the platform. So when you see the chart on the report, on the right hand, you will find a little sign when you can download the information on Excel. Of course, we don't provide detailed company level information because of course we have some agreements with our data providers, but we provide the information for the sector that is the same we are disclosing like in the charts. And yes, we have the values too.
So indeed, that means you can see the percentage reduction that is required, the percentage reduction that is required as specific to your portfolio. So to answer your question, yes, thanks. Great, I'll take this opportunity then. If there are any more questions, we'll stay online. But in the meantime, just again, a massive thank you to all the participants. Big thank you to the organizers at SIP. We will post these slides and recordings after the webinar. And finally, a massive thank you to our WWF, our implementation partners, and of course, UK Pact, the funders of this project as well. Also encourage you to go check out their website to see some of the other bits of work that they're doing under this Malaysia country program as well. Yeah, great question, actually. So question just coming in about the regionality, someone from the WWF UAE office. So to understand if they have local regional presence support in the region. So I'm going to expand this question a bit for the relevance of the group and also try to answer this directly. In terms of different levels of support, we, 2 Degrees Investing Initiative, and now your Malaysia team and WWF as well, are quite well versed. Of course, we designed methodology in the methodology. So happy to assist in terms of understanding it and implementing it. We as an institution are not a consultancy, so you can't hire us to do that. But as part of this project in Malaysia, we do have funding to support users. So I think it's really important to the investors on this call that this is a good opportunity to get like technical assistance. We haven't done too much work in the Middle East. However, really keen to explore options there and to support you in that as well. We can pick that up bilaterally perhaps. But why I wanted to bring this question to the group as well and kind of expand it is to ask about, is to mention the regionality that PACTA provides. So PACTA, within these scenarios we're talking about, we have different decarbonization pathways and goals for each individual region. So this varies in granularity between scenarios, but it's not always global. So what we did with the previous pilot study with the banks is we benchmarked all of the results to a Southeast Asia target. So with PACTA, we're not saying that you need to decarbonize at the rate of the global economy, the European economy, the North American one, but rather we allow you to decarbonize based on the NDCs, the policies of the region. So we allow for kind of regionality within the scenario approach we take. And how we do that is we have the geolocation of all of those individual assets. So if you have assets within Malaysia and you have assets within Europe that you own or you finance, we are not saying that you need to decarbonize the Malaysia ones at the rate required for the European ones, but rather the Malaysian ones have to decarbonize at the rate required by the Malaysian decarbonization pathways. So I hope that practical side, but then also a regionality side from the methodology as well. And I think I see another question coming in, and thanks so much for bringing these forward. Yeah, good question. So perhaps this one's to Naira. Do you analyze investment portfolios at the group level or subsidiary level? Subsidiaries in Malaysia may have different mandates, portfolios from the group.
Great, thanks a lot for the question. So it really depends on how you prefer to upload the information. Of course, we can produce different reports for different portfolios. So what you can do in the interactive report, for example, is upload one Excel file with all the information. And in the second column, you will differentiate the portfolio of your group and differentiate the subsidiaries with different names. So in the end, you will have one PACTA result per subsidiary, and you can aggregate them and generate a PACTA result for the whole group, let's say.
Great, thank you very much, Naira. Any more questions? Any more comments as well? Of course, always welcomed. Yeah, nothing coming in. Okay, so great question here. How do you use PACT results for risk management? Is your stress testing tool applicable to investors? Yes, so really good question, and one we're going to get deep into in the dedicated webinar on risk management use case. But to touch on it already, we so PACTA, this alignment piece, can be informative at a qualitative level from a risk management perspective. The transition disruption metric that Naira was describing towards the end, I think is a really good step towards highlighting the late and sudden transition versus like a slow and managed transition, and what that will mean from a transition risk perspective. So in terms of narratives, in terms of qualitatively understanding risk, PACTA in itself, it already starts to answer some of those questions. Then if we look at the stress testing side of it, so trying to look at a more quantitative dollar value as part of your risk management, yes, we have a separate tool for this, and this is what we refer to as the climate stress test. So slightly different to a traditional stress test, but still looking to get the same outputs. And this is included as part of the free interactive online report, and we will touch on that in the next webinar. And there is an open source code base, although it might be a bit complicated to follow, that takes you through the stress test. This stress test has been applied. There's two different stress tests, essentially. There's a corporate lending stress test, which takes a Merton model, and then an investor one that looks at a discounted cash flow. And the investor one has been used by IOPA, which is the it's a pension fund regulator in Europe. It's being used in Japan as well, and individual financial institutions have used it. I'll hand over to Naira to supplement that as well.
Yes, thank you, George. Well, PACTA can for sure be used for risk management. We will go to more details in the webinar we will dedicate to that topic. But what I can say now is like, with the trends you can see on the different charts and metrics that we have on the report, you can already see that if there is a change in regulation or in technologies and the companies you are not invested in are not evolving with the green technologies, then the portfolio might have the risks to finish with the stranded assets or lost value. We will go into more details in the webinar that we will dedicate to this, but also in the interactive report, we have one module that is dedicated to the stress test methodology. So this methodology it's apart from PACTA. So what we presented today is the PACTA methodology. The stress test module is generated using the PACTA output. And we will also present what is included in the interactive report in the next presentation that we will have, because that is part of the report. In that section, you will be able to see the part of the portfolio that is analyzed that can be affected. You will see in a percentage how much it can be the change of the value of the portfolio and in a nominal value, and which are the sectors in those changes. So that's what I can mention
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah, also we talk about risk management. We've got to think about how do we manage that risk. So this then gets into questions about how do we drive impact? How do we mitigate risk? How do we manage it? We can do this through engaging with our clients. We can do this through portfolio reallocation. PACTA as a methodology doesn't prescribe one of those approaches over the other. And indeed, different users, be it active investors versus more passive ones, might have different approaches to this. So understanding risk being one point, stress testing being a product that can help us do that, one that's derived off the back of PACTA. And then also, how do we manage that risk? We need to think about ways in which we can drive an action change. That in itself is its own defined use case specific to different users as well. I hope that gives a bit of an appetite for some of the later webinars, and also to encourage you again that these are still open areas of research. The space, not just 2 degrees, but cross-regulation across these new initiatives that are popping up, in-house, everyone's thinking about these topics, and it's a really good opportunity to have your say in the way in which we're designing our free and open source tools, and particularly in relevance to your region, so that we can help you to answer some of these questions as well. That's a little plug to encourage you to reach out, especially when we're there in person from the 9th to the 13th. And I'm just talking as we wait to see if there's any more questions. But if there's not, we can always end this webinar early and buy ourselves 10 minutes to hopefully fill out the survey. So perhaps that's the best thing we can do. I'll stay on the line. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop off and give yourselves 10 extra minutes to go fill out that survey, which is linked in the chat and should only take 5 minutes anyway. Great, so thank you everyone. I'll stay online in case there's any questions popping up in the next 10 minutes, but otherwise enjoy the rest of your day and all the best.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I think we can probably end the webinar there then.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Great, thanks everyone. See you next time. Cheers, bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.